since it's Mother's Day, I suspect more people will probably trickle in, but you should have co-host privileges and you should be able to share your screens.
Okay, let me just see if I can do that. Oh, just hang on one minute. I had it all set up and then I went out of it in order to phone you guys about it. Right, okay. Okay, is that coming through?
Yeah, there we go.
Great, okie dokie. Well, welcome everybody, and it's good to see you all. I hope you had a good service, and we'll do our best to get it down into what we can do as quickly as we can. Right. So good to see you and welcome to those online. I can also see a few folk from Exeter that are joining us as well, so that's good. Welcome to the third of our sessions on sex, money, power, violence, and the meaning of life. And today we're looking at the meaning of life. We have Matthew to thank for the I originally wanted to call this Following Jesus, following on from Imitating Jesus, and as Matthew suggested, you should change it around and call it Money, Sex, Power, Violence, and put that in the subtitle. And then he changed the subtitle to, when we were doing this, it was just, can we actually follow Jesus today? And that's what we're trying to tackle, looking at both, on the one hand, what is in the New Testament ethical content, and on the other, has the church followed it through church history, and most importantly of all, can we do it today? And I did offer Matthew some nice easy topics like the theology of St. John, but he went for this one. Normally I do each of these topics in a study day, so it's been a bit of a rush the last few weeks, and it will be even more of a rush today with you having started so late. But in the first session, we were looking at finding a method. And I did warn you that when I've done this before, we're going through the method 5 or 6 times, and people find the first time through more difficult. Then we do it with a topic and another topic and another. And I've tried switching the topics around, it makes no difference. It's just that we get used to the method. And we discovered last week by starting with concentrated stuff on stained glass windows across the world, and then looking at the New Testament material, that there was a major disjunct ever since Constantine became Roman Emperor in 312, and had that vision of conquering in the sign of the cross. And from then on, the church has been sponsoring armies and so on, having been a pacifist organization ever since Jesus in the first 2 centuries. So the answer, can we actually follow Jesus today, with last week, was no. So the question is, can we do it this week in the whole area of the meaning of life? And I was working on this back in over 10 years ago now, when I first did some of this in DC and then in San Francisco and in Hawaii. And I went to Melbourne just as there was an absolute media storm about what was being called after-birth abortion. And this was an article in an academic article by 2 philosophers in the Journal of Medical Ethics, Francesca Minerva and Alberto Giubilani. And they were just 2 philosophers who wrote an article a philosophical article for the Journal of Medical Ethics. And they, as academics do, they put their emails at the end of the article. It was a thought experiment. The world went absolutely bananas, particularly in America. And I ended up being in Melbourne and watching 24-hour police armed guard outside these people's door. they weren't necessarily proposing it, but they were asking this philosophical question. I just want to try and sum it up for you. They pointed out that fetuses, and for that matter newborns, are not yet actual persons. Well, at least the fetuses and up to newborns are not persons. There's not any moral equivalent. They are potential persons prior to birth, and potential persons have no rights. And under Australian law at the time, and I'm confused about American law again now, abortion was permissible up to birth, also through the period at times when if the child was unwanted or inconvenient for the mother, but right up to the moment before birth if they discovered that the fetus was disabled or, and I use this word advisedly, abnormal. And they asked the question, what is the difference 5 minutes after birth between what it was like before when you could abort it and after birth? So they asked simply from a moral philosophical point of view, is abortion equally okay in similar cases? And if you discover a problem a day or two before the birth and it's okay to abort, and you discover a problem a minute after the birth, why can't you abort at that point? Especially since adoption is not a realistic alternative, because nobody's going to adopt a baby with severe health issues and so on. They didn't set a time limit. How long does it last before the newborn acquires human rights? Is it 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year? How long does it go on? And this was a philosophical query. However, they then found they were invited onto a couple of southern US radio stations run by evangelists and so on. And they were thought, oh, this is good publicity for our articles. They did the interview, and the world fell in. And there were death threats from the pro-life lobby, particularly in the United States, but all over. They had to have 24-hour armed guard, which I found rather interesting, that pro-lifers were making, so-called pro-lifers, people who claimed to be in favour of life, were making death threats against these two philosophers who weren't necessarily proposing this. They were simply asking what's wrong with the logic here. They were following the logic through and needing them to have 24 armed guard. Now that was 10 years ago, but actually, if anything, the last 10 years it's become much more of a contested area in America, with the appointments that President Trump made in his first term to the Supreme Court. And you can see from this banner that's up, this is just the beginning, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I downloaded this from the White House web page in January. Notice the headline on the White House fact sheet, overwhelmingly popular demand. President Trump promised and delivered. President Trump promised to protect and defend the vote of the people from within the states on the issue of life. And it's interesting that it's used there on the issue of life rather than necessarily on the issue of abortion. And that's why I'm calling this week on life. And that presidential declaration, executive order, stopped taxpayer dollars being used for abortions as health care in federal terms, or for travel to different states in order to be able to obtain an abortion, and stopped all the funding for lots and lots of overseas groups across the world who were doing humanitarian and health activities, which included, particularly in some of the poorest areas in Latin America and so on, providing for abortion. And that was all just immediately stopped overnight. So this is a very, if you'll pardon the word, live issue of life. And on the 24th of June 2022, the Supreme Court, by a majority of 6-3, overturned the great previous decision of Roe v. Wade, which permitted abortion in America and said it was a federal and constitutional right, and the following Act under Planned Parenthood of 1992, and declared that abortion is not a constitutional right. And of course that was done, let's say, by a 6-3 split by judges mostly appointed by President Trump in his first term. Interestingly, only a few months or so ago, the Supreme Court, by the same majority, refused to overturn the safe buffer zone in abortion clinics. Because of the protests against abortion outside abortion clinics, protesters were getting really close, particularly armed protesters, threatening women who were going into the clinic for advice. And there was a decision to have a safe buffer zone. We have the same in England. And the protests are now trying to get rid of those buffer zones which are there to protect people going in and out seeking for medical advice. And what I find really interesting about this picture is it says, claims science says abortion kills a human being. That is just simply not true. And the claim, I am human at 16 weeks old, is again, philosophically and scientifically, at the very least, not proven. And the vast majority of scientists, biologists, and philosophers would disagree. But once again, I find it curious. You have armed police there. You have people who are keen on so-called pro-life who are blowing up abortion clinics or shooting doctors. How can you be pro-life on one hand and yet use violence against those who think that they're doing healthcare? That's at one end of life. At the other end of life, this is Terry Pratchett. So Terry Pratchett, the author of the Discworld novels, who died at the age of 67 from advanced Alzheimer's disease. He had contracted this at some point. It was a rather strange version of it, and he gave substantial sums of money to King's College London when I was the dean for research into the area. And he carried on working. He had an assistant who would type up the last couple of novels for him as long as he possibly could. And he said he wanted to sit in his deck chair. He was a very committed atheist, but he wanted to sit in his deck chair with Spem in Alium by Thomas Tallis playing on his iPod. I don't know if Richard Clement is in the room, but he will be able to tell you Spem in Alium is a 40-part motet. A beautiful, very, very difficult, complicated motet to sing in 40 parts. I have done it myself, being one of the minor basses in the 5th sub-choir. But it's based upon the text of the psalm, I have no hope in anyone else other than you, O Lord. So I find it rather moving that he wanted to sit in his deck chair with a very fine glass of brandy and some barbiturates and die at the point when he wanted to do so. And if you know the Discworld novels, the figure of death, always in capital letters, is a constant figure throughout the novels. But Pratchett was diagnosed with this 10 years before he died and got very interested in the debate about assisted dying and assisted suicide and produced a documentary called Choosing to Die in 2011, which won the Emmy Award for the Best Documentary in 2012, in which he followed several people, some who made the decision when they were terminally ill to stay alive. One was Peter Smedley, who had motor neurone disease, who went to the Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland. And Terry Pratchett filmed the death live on TV as part of the documentary. And here you can see Terry Pratchett meeting Peter Smedley. The lady on Smedley's right, our left, is his wife, who was beautifully made up and fully supportive of him, but obviously very grieving already. And the woman with the glasses is the Swiss doctor, and you can see that the barbiturates and so on are there on the table. And Peter Smedley's wife said, you know, we could have had another 3 or 4 years, but it had to be done whilst Peter was still mentally capable and able to travel. And if there was any suggestion that his wife had helped him to travel or helped him to die, she would be done for attempted murder. The programme produced protests again from the pro-life lobby in the UK and protests from the Archbishop of Canterbury and all the bishops in the House of Lords against this. And 10 years on, we're now having the assisted dying debate or the assisted suicide debate in the UK Parliament and also in Scotland and the question of when somebody has died but is still physically alive, or when they're brain dead perhaps, but they're on life support, how do we decide to turn off the life support? So both those examples raise for us the question, where, when, and how do you draw the line when life begins and when life ends? And to bring it back to America, here's the similar debates you're having. Over here, you call it medical aid in dying, MAID, an assistant. It is not euthanasia or mercy killing. The medics cannot administer the drugs. The person has to be mentally capable and physically capable of administering the drugs themselves, which means that often happens earlier than perhaps it needed to. Otherwise, the medics or the nurses can be prosecuted for murder. So euthanasia or mercy killing is still illegal. But here you can see which states in America assisted dying is legal. Oregon was one of the first places in the world to do that, and you've got legislature pending in a number of other states. So the question is, how do we use the New Testament in these debates? And I've referred several times to Richard Hayes and his work, and he says a really interesting question on page 445. He says the absence of explicit New Testament evidence about abortion, and that is, of course, very unlike war last week. We found so much material in the New Testament about war and violence. Here we're now going to the other extreme. What do we do with a topic when we don't have much New Testament material or any New Testament material? And Richard himself argued that, first of all, a certain humility about our claims and conviction concerning abortion is appropriate, despite the fact it was one of his major chapters, and despite the fact that the New Testament hasn't got anything to say about it. Richard came out against abortion in the book. He only referenced two texts, Luke 1, which is about the infant or the fetus of Jesus in Mary's womb, and Luke 1:41 about similarly for John the Baptist. We'll come to them in a minute. He also referenced Galatians 5:20, the works of the flesh, which includes the word pharmakeia, gives us our English word pharmacy, which means medical medicines or medical potions. And some people are claiming that means abortifacients. Actually, it just means all medicine. So in the absence of all New Testament material, Richard Hayes turned to use the Old Testament to provide what he called the relevant text instead. And you know that when I hosted Jesus and Brian with Terry Jones and John Cleese, they argued that Jesus was a great moral teacher, and the book, the New Testament, was a book of ethical teaching, which they respected. And I suggested that both of these things are a problem from a genre point of view. And we went through this for the last 2 weeks very briefly. Both points are actually not true. If I say I like the restaurant at the end of the universe, I'm not actually talking about a restaurant, I am talking about a book. And therefore, Jesus is not a moral teacher. He's a preacher in the Old Testament prophetic tradition. But as we saw last week with violence, there's a huge amount of moral and ethical teaching in his teachings. And so we have to ask the question, what can we find about the whole issue of abortion? Answer nothing. About the value of life? Answer a lot. Equally, the New Testament is not an ethics book. It doesn't contain any books that are written in ethical genres. We did see it contained a lot of material about war and violence. We've now seen from Richard Hayes it contains nothing about abortion, but it does, the question is, what can we use about the idea of life? So what is Jesus and what is the Bible? I've pointed out that the Gospels are lives of Jesus written according to the conventions of ancient lives, so we have to look at their portrait of Jesus' deeds and words. And this is what I was given the prize for from the previous Pope Francis. And here I am giving a copy of my book, Four Gospels, One Jesus, to Pope Francis. And there are a few remaining books of mine on the bookstall, and Gary will happily sell them to you afterwards. But this project on news ethics I've been working on for 25 years. The first volume, Imitating Jesus, and the second volume, Following Jesus, or now, if I agree with Matthew, which I do, we're going to call it Money, Sex, Power, Can We Follow Jesus?, takes the implications of genre for New Testament ethics seriously. It takes Jesus seriously as a preacher of restoration eschatology, the idea that at the end of all things, God will restore the kingdom. And therefore, he is not primarily setting out to provide moral or ethical teaching. He's preaching the kingdom of God. And unlike a moral teacher who's preaching laws that he wants obeyed, Jesus is wanting people to follow him. And therefore, I'm taking the Gospels seriously as ancient biography, and we must consider both his ethical teaching and his practice, the commands and the narrative. Luke makes it clear at the beginning of the book of Acts. In the first book, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach, his words and his deeds. Now, the point about this is that most ethicists just look at his words, his teachings, and ignore the fact that his teachings are situated within a biography of somebody who spends all his time with people who are not actually carrying out what his were. And it is also a process that allows for including the people we disagree with. And I've praised your project on braver angels. And this is the way in which I was suggesting we need to try to bridge the gap between the first century and our topics. How do we handle the very different cultures there are on both sides of the gap? And how do we deal with the fact that many of our topics, like nuclear war, like same-sex issues, which we'll come to in 2 weeks' time, abortion, IVF, embryo research, and so on, are not mentioned in the New Testament? And so my way of handling this is to say that you cannot ask 21st century questions of a first century text. On the other hand, both sides of the cultural divide have these human moral experiences of money, sexuality, power, violence, beginning and end of life issues. Every human society has formulated ethics, laws, taboos, customs around these topics. These are the topics where we come up against what it means to be basically human. They are the frontiers between humanity and the universe, if you like. And although the different answers that all human societies come up with may be different, there's a remarkable consistency across the board in terms of these topics. And it is this that gets us across the bridge, gets us over the cultural gap, i.e. between the 21st century and the first century, because although there's nothing in the New Testament about same-sex relations or abortion, there's plenty about the meaning of life, plenty about love and marriage and so on. And it gets us over this contingency of issues, the problem we discovered about carrying a legionary's pack or meat offered to idols and so on. And out of Richard Hayes, and then I've tweaked it into this fourfold method, which we followed in theory in week 1 and with War and Violence last week. The descriptive task that begins with Jesus' deeds and words, the use of the so-called triple tradition. That means the 3 witnesses. I explained this last week, but I'm explaining it again. Things that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we start with that because we're also wanting to use historical tools to really see, can we be sure we're talking about the words of the historical Jesus. And I use a dragnet where I look up all the words to do with. So I looked at war, violence, peace, and all that last time. Here I've looked up all the issues to do with particularly the word life, but looking at them in terms of narrative as well as teaching, stories and examples, in order to give a full exegesis of what Hayes calls the relevant text. And again, I explained exegesis last week. Simply comes from the Greek, leading out, and that's what all preachers and teachers of the Bible are trained to do, to lead out from the Bible the meaning of the text. I'm sure that what doesn't happen in your church is what does happen in far too many churches, where the preacher is doing eisegesis, which is where you read your own ideas into the Bible and then tell people about that with the added ingredient that God agrees with you. Exegesis is really important to work out what the text really means. And then we bring all these texts together, grappling with the tensions. Hayes used, we saw, the focal images of cross-community and new creation. I prefer to look at what I call the best line fit on a scattergram. And having established a direction of travel with Jesus, his deeds and words, we look at how Paul and the rest of the New Testament follow or don't follow the direction set by Jesus' teaching and example, deeds and words. Then thirdly, the interpretive task, where we do the exegesis, where we bring everything, all the material we've gathered, across the bridge to our world today. And we do that looking at 4 subgenres of ethical material: rules, principles, paradigms or examples, an overall biblical worldview, and the main biblical doctrines. And then finally, in the practical task, we see where it can all be applied to the specific issues today. And I've argued from my experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, you need an inclusive community of interpretation. If you just let white Afrikaners read the Bible, they will come up with a reading of the Bible that benefits white Afrikaners. If you let white elderly male Anglican bishops discuss things on their own, they will make sure that women are not allowed to join their golf club, the House of Bishops. The point is, you have to have the people who are going to be affected in the discussion, as we had at the TRC, an open table, listening to those we disagree with, back to TJ's wonderful project on braver angels. So that's the fourfold method. Stage 1, the descriptive task, Hayes' statement, the full exegesis of the relevant texts. My question was, how do you decide what are the relevant texts? In the issue of violence we did last week, Richard had so many texts. He chose one text, which was particularly pacifist, and the dominant text, and then interpreted all the others in that light. To which the question was, Richard, is this the moral vision of the New Testament, or is this the moral vision of Richard Hayes? On what basis do you single out that one text from so many? This week we have the alternative problem of finding some relevant texts. What if there are none to dealing with abortion, stem cell research, same-sex issues, or when you turn off a life support machine? As I said, what Richard did was to go back to the Old Testament. And of course we have to bear that in mind, the social, historical background for Jesus and the New Testament writers. They would have known a whole sequence of texts in the Old Testament that talk about the sovereignty of God who gives and takes away life. Job begins, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And it's there also in Psalm 104. And the story of the creation of the first two human beings in Genesis 2 may be a story, but it is beautifully done in that God forms Adam, out of Adamah, the dust of the ground. In other words, he creates a human being out of physical molecules, physical dust, chemicals, and so on. So you are stardust, as the Woodstock generation reminds us. Our heavy chemicals in our body were formed in stars. And then he opens up the side of the Adam, the earth creature, which is probably a better meaning, and extracts from it a rib, which he names Evach, which means life. And God breathes the life, his own very life, the breath of God, into the earth creature. So human beings, male and female, are made out of physical elements with the breath of God breathed into them. And it's significant that when there are the two of them, male and female, they make up the imago Dei, the image of God. The whole point is, or in Greek, it's the icon of God, which gives us the word icon. It comes into Latin as imago Dei. One or the other on their own is not the image of God. Together they are the image of God. And it was pointed out in the Martin Luther King lecture at BTS, where I'm staying, Virginia Seminary, a couple of weeks ago on Martin Luther King Day, of course, that the imago Dei is DEI, and that part of the image of God is seen in the diversity and equality and identity of not just different genders, different races, and so on. That's how we see the richness of God in Genesis chapter 1, and it comes up again after Cain and Abel in chapter 5, after Noah and the flood in chapter 9. And God commands human beings not to kill. But again, what do we mean by that translation, kill? Does it mean kill, or does it mean murder? And as I say, it comes up in those passages at the beginning of Genesis, after Cain and Abel, after Noah and the flood, and of course it's there in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. And so what I was doing was to say, okay, how do I get the text? Well, I draw a dragnet through the whole New Testament, looking for all the verses that include the word life, and there were 200 of them. Same as I ended about 200 verses to do with war and violence, which is why I was asking the question about why Richard prioritized the one he did. And although he says there's nothing in the New Testament about abortion or euthanasia, there are 200 verses about this particular human moral experience of life. And so I begin with Jesus, the triple tradition, Matthew, Mark, Luke, as I've said, and looking at his deeds and his words, his narrative and his example. Now, interestingly, there are remarkably few words or commands from Jesus about this. That we do have this extraordinary situation where the saying of those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake or the sake of the gospel will find it. It's not just in the triple tradition, it's in the quadruple tradition, because it comes in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there are 3 other different versions of it also in the Gospels. So it's the septuple tradition. It comes up 7 times. And it has all the ring of the authentic way in which Jesus spoke in paradox. Saving life, losing it, losing life, finding it. I'll give you some of the verses there. The only other direct command he gives about life, or the 2 other direct commands, are not very helpful. One is that you should cut off what stops you entering life. He says, if your hand or your foot causes you to sin and stops you entering into life, cut it off. Well, and I found, when I was looking this last couple of weeks, I found this really rather disturbing image on the internet. What I find extraordinary, I've served in many, many churches, and most people are trying to follow Jesus, but they know they make mistakes. But there's a remarkable lack of one-handed or one-footed or one-eyed people. Jesus explicitly tells us to cut it off. We do not obey Jesus. Equally, in Luke, Jesus tells us we have to hate your life if you want to follow me. These are not particularly helpful or positive commands, but they are 2 commands of Jesus. What do we do about them? How do we interpret them? But I've pointed out, I don't just look at his words, I look at his example. And here we have huge amounts of material, particularly his love for all of those who are marginalized on the edges of society, the old, the women, non-Jews, and especially children, and those who are suffering. Jesus gets angry, and on a number of occasions in the Gospels, we saw that he was using a whip of cords to move cattle out of the temple, not a whip used on human beings, as the great artists often depict. But the most time we see Jesus with emotions, and the Gospels refer to him being deeply troubled or deeply stirred up. The Greek word is embrimo, which is to snort in the nostrils. It's used of horses. You know how horses snort through their nostrils. In the presence of illness, disease, and death, Jesus snorts in his nostrils like a horse. And for him, saving life is much more important than moral commands like the Sabbath. And that's where he gets himself into trouble, for healing on the Sabbath. And in his approach to those who are dead or dying, we see him with great sorrow and mourning, and his compassion for Jairus' daughter. This is a rather fanciful image of it here, or the widow of Nain, who's lost her son, and there with it also because only men had property in houses, and when she would be penniless and homeless, and he raises her son back to life, and Lazarus, who we will come to. But the interesting thing is that the one life that Jesus is not interested in and not protecting is his own. He regularly speaks of his willingness to give for his life as a ransom for many. And so I've talked about this idea of, when you try to bring them all together, of a scattergram, which is a mathematical diagram where you plot all your results on, and you look for the best line fit, like we trace the line of the galaxy, the Milky Way, in the night sky. And there are things that are out of preference scores where it makes us go, oops, like last week we formed 2 sayings about swords. We looked at them, they were off the line, and we managed to bring them back on the line. And Guillemet, a French-Canadian Jesuit, said Jesus does not give directives. In other words, he's not an ethical teacher or a commander. He rather gives a direction. And Jesus' direction is clear. It has a strong stress on for life. God is the source of life and the goal of all life. And he lives out his teaching confronting disease and death, and yet he's willing to suffer and lay down his own life. Now we come to the double tradition, things that are in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, known in the trade as Q, for the German word Quelle, meaning source. But don't worry about that. But here's just a couple of things that occur in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Do not worry about your life, and the warning that you will need to give an account for your life after death. The parable of the sheep and the goats, the parable of the rich fool in Matthew and Luke. Then we move to the single tradition, i.e. in just one gospel, and Matthew takes the Old Testament's 10 commandments and intensifies them. He says, you have heard it said, do not murder. I say to you, do not be angry. So he actually takes the commandments and makes them so much stronger. And he says that there are few who find the narrow gate that leads to life. When we look at the single tradition in Luke, we see great sorrow for the lack of children in childless couples. And God seems particularly interested in childless couples, and that is very significant for stem cell research. With Zechariah and Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1. And of course, the great joy at the birth of a baby when John the Baptist is born, and similarly when Jesus is born. There are these two comments in Luke chapter 1 which refer to the babe in the womb, i.e. when the angel Gabriel is talking to Mary, and when Mary enters the house of Elizabeth and John the Baptist leaps in the womb. And this was used by Pope John Paul II in the Roman Catholic Doctrine Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. Notice the word again, section 45, page 80. And means that we cannot have abortion because you might abort a baby John the Baptist or abort Jesus, for instance. And this is often linked to the Old Testament passage about fetal life, like where God talks about knowing Jeremiah in the womb or knowing the psalmist in the womb, and say God knows everybody in the womb and has eternal destinies for them. Those passages do not actually say that. They say that God knew Jeremiah and knew he wanted him to be a prophet in the womb. He knew the psalmist. But given that something like 20 or 30 or 40% of fertilized fetuses spontaneously miscarry and abort, this makes it difficult to say that there is an eternal plan for everything from the moment, in quotes, of conception, which takes actually 24 hours. And at the other end of life, God, in the parable of the rich fool, who wants to pull down his barns and build more of them, he decides that tonight is the end of your life. And we have it similarly, of course, with the parable of Dives and Lazarus, the rich man and the poor man in Luke 19. Life is one of John's favourite words, staying with the single tradition. He has it over 30 times. That's twice as often as Matthew, Mark and Luke put together. And the great Johannine prologue begins with, "In him was life," and eternal life is connected to the Son. The Father raises the dead and gives life. Jesus is the source and the means of life. And his favourite I am sayings are, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I want you to have life in all its fullness. I am the resurrection of the life." And Jesus is clear that he's laying down his life for others. No one is taking his life away in John. But he also has huge grief, both for Lazarus' death, which gives us the often quoted two-word verse, Jesus wept, and his comforting of Mary Magdalene in her grief in John chapter 20. If we then move further on and say, okay, that's how the gospel writers follow Jesus, and they clearly are following him very faithfully. What about the rest of the New Testament? Luke in Acts regularly describes Jesus as the author of life in chapter 3, when Peter is talking to the Roman centurion Cornelius in Acts chapter 11, when Paul is rejected by Jews in the synagogues in 13, he says, I'm going to go and offer life to the Gentiles. And when he gets to Athens, he gives a sermon to the Athenians, which is based on Greek philosophy, stressing that it is God who is the one who gives life and breath to all, quoting not the scriptures, but Greek philosophical poetry. When we come to Paul, Richard Hayes has here this one use of the works of the flesh, like murder and hatred and so on, includes this word pharmakeia, means medical potions, magical drugs and so on. It doesn't mean abortifacients. But Paul does have lots of very positive things about life. God gives life to the dead, calls things into existence that do not exist, and it's linked into Jesus as the conqueror of death, and death is the last enemy. O death, where is thy sting? And the way to eternal life is linked with Jesus. He constantly says that we walk in a new life, that we have died in baptism. It's not I who live. I live my life in the flesh or in the body by Jesus. I'm manifesting his life. Paul even says that he wants to die, because he says to live is Christ and to die is gain. And actually Paul says, look, to be perfectly honest, I'm fed up with being in prisons. I would quite like to die, to leave the body behind and go and be with Christ, which is a lot better. But actually I'm staying for your sake. And whether we live or we die, we do it all for Christ. And the body is the temple of the Spirit, and we're meant to glorify God in our body. And therefore Christ is exalted in Paul's body in life or death, and he sees great value in his sufferings. What is interesting, Hayes doesn't consider the one verse in the New Testament which might refer to abortion. He does say in his discussion of the resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, after saying Jesus has appeared to the disciples and Peter and a crowd of 500 and so on, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now the Greek word there, ektroma, literally means something that is thrust out. Ek, out, and trauma is to thrust or to cause trauma. And it refers to an abortion and a miscarriage. And does this mean that he was saying he was born out of time? Well, normally an ectroma is born prematurely and doesn't survive. Paul's problem was he was born too late to spend time with the earthly Jesus. Some people think it's a reference to him accepting that his own appearance, he looked like a bit of an abortion. He was physically very unattractive. But whatever this text means, it's about the resurrection of the King of Life to Paul. It doesn't help us with abortion, which is why Richard probably didn't include it. And the rest of the New Testament, the same message continues. God gives life to all, life that is really life. There's the crown of life after death. The first letter of John, we saw how the Gospel of John has lots about life. The first letter of John continues that you have passed from death to life if you love others. But it also tells us to follow Jesus' self-sacrificial model of laying down our life for others. And of course, the book of Revelation, part of the Johannine material, the material to do with John, is full. 17 uses the word life, the tree of life, the crown of life, the book of life, the water of life. And being faithful to death brings life. So if we put all this on our scattergram, we see the same trajectory running from the teachings of Jesus and the example of Jesus through the rest of the New Testament. And in fact, we can see the same trajectory going right back into the Old Testament. The Bible is very consistent that God is the source, ground, and goal of all life, and its concern is for human beings to live life in its fullness, with a total opposition to all that detracts from life: sin, sickness, suffering, evil, and death. But there's also a very strong second theme, that this present human life in the body is not an end in itself, and it may need to be sacrificed, as Jesus sacrificed his own life, as Paul was willing to do, for the sake of eternal life in God. Then in third, the interpretive stage, we looked at the 4 subgenres that came out of the work of James Gustafson, I mentioned in the first week, genres as modes of appeal, and how you need to keep commands and principles, examples separate. And we looked in the first week at the example of the way in which the pro and anti-apartheid interpretations of Scripture used the same methods and came up with different views. So the first subgenre is rules. Well, there are no direct rules about abortion or early or life or the end of life. Matthew 19:18 restates the commandments, says, you shall not kill. That's a command, may mean murder. But the question is the fetus human life? We have to get our biology right. Secondly, in Matthew 5, he intensifies not murder to include anger. And so I find it very interesting that in the attacks on abortion clinics, the anti-abortionists, who claim to be pro-life, are using hatred and violence against those who are trying to be medical clinics in their claim to be pro-life. There is the one direct command which we don't obey. Cut off what stops you entering life, pluck out your eye. How do we interpret it? We have a very clear, literal command from Jesus, which the church generally, people do not follow. But we also have the command about do not worry about your life. And then secondly, if we look at principles, there's the principle of God as the author of life at the beginning and the end, that the body in which God breathes the breath of God is the temple of the Spirit. In the parable of the sheep and goats, where their judgment is by what you do to the least of my brethren, which is quoted by Pope John Paul II in The Gift of Life, Donum Vitae, and in translate, the least of the brethren means the unborn. I find it quite hard to see that interpretation when Matthew is talking about going and those, because they say, Lord, when did we see you naked, or when did we see you hungry, and when did we see you in prison? Those are the least of the brethren, and that's what Jesus says they are. It doesn't say anything about the unborn. But we do see Jesus' stress on life, the theology of John about life, and the value of suffering, that this life is not life alone. The ultimate is early life. When we look at the examples or the paradigms, we have those two examples of the fetus of John the Baptist and the fetus of Jesus. John the Baptist sleeping in the womb, and as the Christmas hymn says, he did not abhor the Virgin's womb. But can you extrapolate from those two, who are rather special people, to all fetuses? And then there's those two negative examples of Herod seeking to destroy children, the young boys up to the age of 2. Well, that's clearly infanticide. Or the dragon waiting to devour the woman's offspring in the vision of the book of Revelation, which is probably about the devil and the church. And in the overall biblical worldview, we take the doctrine of creation, where we see clearly how God gives life and breathes life into the physical bodies of human beings, the value and worth of all human beings, and the place of human beings in the universe. We also live in a fallen world where sin and death have entered the world. And one of the first things was, of course, Cain and Abel killing your brother. You are your brother's keeper. So we are expected as part of life to have a care and our concern for the others. Then there's the incarnation, where God values human life enough to take it upon himself in Jesus of Nazareth. And through that to bring redemption, new life to all. And the resurrection shows us that evil and death cannot triumph ultimately. Jesus' eternal life has victory. O death, where is your sting? And therefore human lives are moving towards the end, the goal, the eschaton in Greek, the place of heaven. And there is this argument that you will meet aborted fetuses in heaven. Well, I've already pointed out that 20 to 40% of fertilized embryos spontaneously abort. And one of the reasons for understanding suffering in this world is that it is preparing us. It is a veil of soul making. If there is a direct route to heaven for miscarried fetuses, then the vast majority of occupants of heaven will not have lived on earth. In stewardship, of course, we have the medical knowledge to help particularly childless couples with things like in vitro fertilization. And that's the other side. And when I was Dean of King's, it was one of the only 2 places in the country that could do work on stem cell research. And the use of one of the best places to get stem cells for helping Parkinson's disease and many other diseases is from the tissue of aborted or miscarried fetal tissue. And you could see that as bringing life out of death, something out of good coming out of the tragedy. And then lastly, how do we actually apply this to our practical issues and get to our conclusions? And that's where in this stage 4, I want to talk about an inclusive community of the interpreters of the text, and where I can bring my knowledge as a biblical scholar, but I also need doctors and nurses and scientists who can explain to us the biology. I was asked to bring Rowan Williams into the Stem Cell Centre in King's College London. We said, look, we may disagree with his theology because he was speaking against abortion and stem cell research in the House of Lords, but he's got his biology wrong. Bring your boss in and we'll give him a day's teaching. And he had his own private day in wearing a scrub suit, looking down the electron microscopes at fetus stem cells dividing and so on. I need to bring my biblical study stuff. People need to bring their scientific stuff, reason and experience. And the experience of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission means that we need to have this inclusive community that allows for the voices of the others to be heard. And that's where you can do the detailed ethical dilemmas. You cannot just simply read off from the New Testament, abortion is wrong, stem cell research is wrong, assisted suicide is wrong, euthanasia is wrong. There is nothing that tells you that. We have seen, however, a very, very strong and positive view of human moral experience, the sanctity and value of human life, and also how that human life often has to be sacrificed for eternal life. And therefore we must discuss these passages in an inclusive community, including the opponents, yes, including the anti-abortion lobby and those who disagree, and listen to the voice of those who will be most affected, i.e. those with who are childless, or with disabled children, or those who are grappling with the terminally ill. And the question always is, has the church followed the clear biblical ethic? And I want to say that the tradition of the church in its medical care has been brilliant in following Jesus in this respect, and though it didn't follow Jesus in terms of violence. And therefore, we do have to include in that group the childless, those with handicapped children, those dealing with terminally ill, the scientists, and so on. And being open to the ethical challenge of Jesus and the voices of the outsiders, rather than being judgmental excluders, threatening and shooting and bombing those we disagree with. And because of the lack of any clear proof text, thou shalt not commit abortion, there's even more reason for the community response to find a way of doing the exegesis, the leading out of the text, and the hermeneutics, the application of the text, without vilification of those we disagree with, listening to the outsiders on all sides. And what's more, our communities have to take responsibility for the cost of any decision, which means that helping with the elderly, the terminally ill. If you are going to say that you're not going to allow any abortion, will the churches adopt and raise the unwanted children? If you cannot abort severely disabled fetuses, will the church take responsibility for raising these unwanted children, because the parents may not be able to do that? And so that's where all our questions at the beginning now come into play once we've got these 200 texts in the New Testament. And we can look at abortion and medical intervention in fertility. We look at what's going on in gene therapy, how we can now, through stem cell research, fix a lot of genetic handicaps in the womb so the child is born healthy. Operations in the womb at the start of life. We also have, at the end of life, prolonged medical treatment of the elderly and the terminally ill. The keeping of people alive through medical terms, sometimes needlessly, and prolonging their suffering, prolonging their pain. Sometimes, and this is particularly true in America, that the doctors are doing that because they are frightened of being sued by medical insurance for allowing the elderly person to die earlier than they did actually doing. And that raises for us the question of assisted dying, or assisted suicide, as it's being called in British Parliament, medically assisted aid in dying, as it's called here. Is there a difference between letting die, i.e. withdrawing care, if necessary, withdrawing nutrients, food, water, and actively killing? And I want to ask, what is the consistency? I find it very strange that the, again, so-called pro-life lobby is very happy with gun ownership, capital punishment, and the use of the armed forces, while you're trying to use violent tactics against the people that they see as being against their view of pro-life. So there is this overall coherence of Jesus' ethical teaching and example, but generally, how little of it the church has put into practice, as we saw last week with war and violence. But in this case, I think throughout history, the church's care of medical missionaries and hospitals is life the exception, where the church has been really following not just the words and examples of Jesus, but the teaching of the whole of the scriptures through the Old Testament and through. And so I asked the question, why have certain hot button issues like abortion or homosexuality become the acid test of whether we're sort of being biblically orthodox, when the much larger and clearer areas, such as the use of non-violence or money, are not being obeyed or followed? And I'm asking, does this fourfold method provide us with ethical material, gets over the problem that Jesus is not a moral teacher, and Jesus is not an ethical book, but gives us plenty of material to work with? And how do we form these inclusive communities to do the Bible study? And then, I've given TJ the PDFs of these sheets already, so you can look at this. Here's just a quick summary about the direction of travel from Jesus through Luke and the rest of the New Testament. It's there in all the four subgenres. It's there in the church's faithful tradition. And I find it very curious, this modern singling out of a couple of simple issues like abortion or stem cell research or assisted dying or euthanasia, as opposed to a much wider look at the church's history and tradition, and the desire for life and the relief of the suffering. And I commend to you again the Braver Angels initiative and also the book table. And at that point, I'm sorry, there's only 5 or 10 minutes for questions, but we started quarter of an hour late. I will shut down my PowerPoint and hand back the Zoom to TJ.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. Can we get a round of applause?
So we've now got an open screen. The thing has stopped, so we can see whether people are. If those who are online want to turn their cameras on or activate a digital hand if they have a question, and I'm hoping that TJ, you can see people in the room who want to ask or a question or make a comment.
Do we have any questions?
He's still sharing his screen. If you could stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Richard, you're still sharing your screen. Do you want to click and share?
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
So I shut down the PowerPoint, but I didn't realize you still had a little thing at the top of the screen.
That's okay. We have a question in the room.
Could you expound a little bit on your use of the term communities as key ingredients in, if you will, pursuing the lives we should be leading. The world would be better for us leading. Could you talk about that? I know it's a big subject.
Well, it's a huge subject and it's not technically on the topic, but I will say a quick word because in case there are others who actually want to answer. The whole point about the image of God is that God is found in our community. And that's what church is about. Jesus does not call us as individuals, he calls us to be part of communities. And the church is the one community which should not be of like-minded people. It is a place where you try to meet and discuss with people with whom you may disagree, back to TJ's Braver Angels project. And what I'm saying is that any single community, like white Afrikaners, like Anglican male bishops, are going to read the Bible in a way that benefits them. What protects us from self-serving reading of the scriptures is reading it with people we disagree with. And that's why when I say communities, I'm just meaning Bible study groups in your church, doing what you're doing with the Braver Angels, getting people together who you may disagree with. I know you've got a session coming up on red and blue, for instance, but getting together people who really are passionate about, say, beginning of life issues like abortion and stem cell research, or end of life issues like the terminally care, on both sides, who will talk to one another about what it's like and their experience and how can we read the Bible in the light of that.
Thank you.
Father, my name is Jim Henderson.
Hi, Jim.
Hi. I've been involved with lots of contests in my life, and particularly political, starting at a very young age. At the age of...
Jim, we're about to run out of time. Can we go straight to the question?
Yes, yeah. Robert's Rules of Order is a recommendation I have. Robert's Rules of Order is a great method of accumulating ideas through the clauses that precede the background that precedes a motion, which is made for an action, or the statement of an opinion. You have whereas, a statement of scientific fact, a statement of opinion, whereas, and then you come to a motion. And there's agreement of some sort with a vote.
I'm very sorry, I didn't, because you're sitting at the back. Maybe TG can repeat it for my sake and the sake online. What is the name of this thing you're talking about?
So Jim's talking about Robert's Rules of Order.
Parliamentary procedure.
And saying that that's a very useful tool a very useful way of getting.
Yes. That's some book that you derived from the English Parliament that goes back centuries and centuries before. I only discovered it recently. Obviously, I'm not familiar with the American version. I'm more familiar with parliamentary procedure. Yes, you're absolutely right. And the point, of course, for us in our General Synod, which is part of Parliament, uses parliamentary procedure, we're governed by exactly the same rules. And so when we have a debate, the job of the chair very often is to try to have a speech for something and a speech against something. And we get a very balanced debate. Quite often we end up with quite a surprise when the vote is taken to discover that actually the majority of people are in favour or against. But the debate has been very balanced because we've been trying to make sure that the voices of everybody is heard. So you're absolutely right about doing that, Jim. Thank you.
Good point.
Any questions from anybody online want to wave a digital hand or turn their camera on and wave a hand? Or any more in the room, TJ?
We have one more in the room. I don't see any online.
Richard, this is Gary.
Hi, Gary.
Am I correct in my understanding of what you have presented, that in culling through the Bible, through the New Testament specifically, and all the references or any references to abortion or late life issues, that you cannot come to a definitive conclusion about this, and you're deferring to science, in essence, to looking to science to provide a definitive answer?
No, that's not what I'm saying, Gary. And so thank you for the question, so give me a chance. I can see why you're thinking that. What I am saying is that this goes back to my image of the Golden Gate Bridge. Remember, I described the fact that I know what to do when I was crossing the River Thames if a Roman legionary asked me to carry the pack, because Jesus says carry his pack 2 miles. This never happened in the 25 years I was Dean of Kings. The problem is that the biblical issues of their day are not the same as our issues. And if we go looking for a verse or a text about abortion, there aren't any. Now, that's really interesting, given that abortion was quite common in the ancient world. And interestingly, it was very common in the Greco-Roman society that if you didn't want a child after it was born, you just exposed it on the hillside. And that was particularly true, I'm afraid, of girl babies. And yet the Bible does not ban that practice or whatever. Jews traditionally did not take part in that, but there's still nothing. If we go looking through, we can't find any specific text on it. We certainly can't find any specific text about stem cell research or the kind of things that we are doing today, many of which helps us in our developing our understanding of life. Equally, it doesn't tell us anything about nuclear weapons or executive financial bonuses or about when we turn off life support machines. And I don't want to say that Jesus and the Bible don't give us any help. And so this method that I've evolved, drawing upon Richard Hayes's, of looking for the topic, and when I looked for the topic of the value of life, I found I had 200 verses. I had as many verses about the value of life as I did about war and violence, and for that matter, as I do about money. Interestingly, there's a lot less verses about marriage and divorce and sexuality, as we'll see in week 4. God seems less interested in those than he is in more violence, the value of human life, and what we do with our money, though you wouldn't believe it from the way the church behaves these days. But these 200 verses, what I was trying to do was to track that scattergram, that like seeing the Milky Way at night. And there is a very, very clear tradition of consistency in Jesus' words and deeds, in his actions as well as his teaching, about the value of life, that it clearly is drawing on the Old Testament, that is followed through the New Testament, and is followed, thankfully, by 2,000 years of Christian medical care, hospitals, medical missionaries, the monastic communities, the early founding of the hospitals, etc., etc. I mean, the fact that nurses are called sisters and wear uniforms, or used to wear uniforms that look very much like nuns, is because the sisters in caring came out of communities of nuns and so on. And therefore, I want to suggest that just at the moment, confining the debate to a couple of minor issues, like abortion or assisted dying and missing the vast stress that God has on the value of human life is to miss the point. But because the only real direct command we have from Jesus is to cut off your hand or your foot or pull your eye out if it causes you to sin. And yet you don't obey that command, or we don't obey that command. So we need this community to say, okay, how does these verses about the value of life apply in our medical situation? Yes, I will let scientists decide when human life begins, because they can tell us by looking at the development of a human being and so on. We have a medical definition of brain death, but we're able to keep physical bodies going for a long time after that, which gives us the moral quandary about when do you turn off a life support machine. And so my experience of working with the scientists and the medics in that sense was that our researchers would often call me across to their labs and say, Richard, can we discuss it with you? And we'd have a whole day on, we are beginning to think we can do this. Should we be doing this? What are the moral issues involved in that? Okay, I hope that helps. Dennis has got his hand up online.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that apropos to what you just said, that this is one of the things I appreciate about your method, is it keeps us centered in a holistic way on the reality that is Christ, and which is a register that is more